filmed on Wednesday, November the 13th. In the Memorial Arena in Victoria. I'd like to thank our volunteer crew and the Shaw staff that makes this all happen. The first part of Citizens Forum is usually the Walter and Jack show, so away we go. It's November the 13th, so 2 days after Remembrance Day. And I just want to say that I'm always, I don't know the word to use, but by the hypocrisy.
You're torn by the emotions.
The hypocrisy of the media on Remembrance Day. Because they take this stance of identifying with the troops, with those who have lost their lives. And yet they always seem to promote more war. And I mean, I saw it in Vietnam. I mean, I was a total believer in what the United States was doing in Vietnam. They were killing millions of innocent people. And I believed it almost to the end because the media told me that they were the good guys, and I believed the media. And I saw it after that in decades of murder and terror that the United States did right through South and Central America. Now it's the Middle East. They've never stopped. And all of this is aided and abetted by the corporate-owned media and the CBC, which is no different. In Canada, and the Americans have it even worse with their corrupt media. And then they come along and they, I think, cry crocodile tears about their concern for the soldiers. You know, if you Google Bush and Hitler and Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, Google Bush and Hitler and Guardian, and the last time I did it, the first story that came up was a story about Prescott Bush, Senator Prescott Bush, the grandfather of the most recent President Bush, the father of the first President Bush. He was involved in part ownership of a bank that was funneling money to the Nazis in the early days when the Nazis were just coming to power. And for any small organization, what you need is money. And obviously, Hitler and his gang were identified by very powerful forces in the United States and in Europe, and they were funneling money to the Nazis, to Hitler, to build it up. And the fact that this is kept secret for decades, it's never mentioned by the corporate media. Think of what that means about our entire nation, because it shows that our entire nation has been, it's totally corrupted, and we're teetering on a knife edge of destruction. I mean, and yet nothing changes. They are so corrupt.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could do a history of the Bush family, and it's really a remarkable story from Prescott Bush to George Bush Sr. to George Bush Jr., and don't forget Jeb Bush, and the governor of Florida, is it? But if you go back, you really realize these connections are not, these are not just conjecture. These are hard evidence. In fact, Prescott Bush, during the war, the U.S. government had brought sanctions against him for ownership of Nazi industry.
That's right. The bank was taken over by the government.
That's right, and also. If you look at the start of Prescott Bush was in the group that brought about the first intelligence agencies in the United States, CIA and all. So I mean, you have to realize that these connections are very real, and it's been estimated, by the way, Jack, that over half of all the money that entered Germany in the 1930s came through these banks that were that the Bushes and others controlled, and they did build up the Nazi war machine. So
and the fact that that can be kept completely secret from the entire North American public for decades just shows the disaster we are in terms of honesty, fairness, democracy, the having of a free press. And we're really at a stage where if we don't get it soon, and it may already be too late. I mean, later we'll talk about this typhoon in the Philippines, but you wanted to just mention the NDP here. It's kind of unfair to bring the, but
how do you seg into that? But the thing is, as you know, both you and I read articles, and and like anyone else, and try to digest them and understand them. And of course, the NDP has issued their report as to why they lost the election. You know, it's a sanctioned report from the people who were calling the shots in the NDP. We're a very small group of people at the top who do call all the shots in that party, and you can't paint the whole party or all the MLAs with this brush. There's a lot of dissension. A lot of people are very unhappy. The thing was that if you read the report, and it's very hard to read because you're going to either laugh or cry about the reasons why they lost the election, that Adrian was too polite and all that. But really, it was such a dishonest campaign. There are real issues that Adrian and John Horgan and David Schreck and the others, all these gurus at the top, agreed not to talk about, including the BC Rail, the sale of the BC Rail scandal, which is still an open wound. And had they brought it up, of course, they were planning on being in government, then they'd have to talk about it after the election, and they'd have to have made promises to clean this up. So they decided, with the insiders of the Liberal Party, okay, you let us be in power, we'll trade some scandals back and forth, that you don't talk about these things, we won't talk about these things, and when we're elected as a provincial government, we won't bring up the BC Rail scandal. And I think really what happened was the Liberals made these deals with the NDP and said, okay, you're going to be in government, and you're going to get elected, and right up to the eve of the election, then they snatched it away, and the NDP didn't get in. And I think if the NDP had have had a grassroots movement with a more democratic decision making about what were the real policies or the real issues, could easily have been in government right now, and we wouldn't be dealing with the terrible things that the Liberals are proceeding with now.
Well, the Liberals had a lot to answer for, none of which was mentioned during the election, including the fact that Christy Clark drove around in a bus that said debt-free BC, even though her government had put our province into debt by $50 to $100 billion over the 12 or so years they were in power. $50 to $100 billion of real debt that we are on the hook for, and somehow that goes completely unmentioned by the media and by the NDP through the entire campaign. So the campaign was a perversion of democracy, because I mean, our whole political process is a perversion of democracy at the provincial level, at the federal level. You know, the municipal level ain't much better, but we can do better. We've just got to reassert a public demand for democracy. And democracy just means really that what the people want is what the governments are doing, because the governments work for the people.
That's
We've
right.
completely lost that. The corporations have taken over. It seems 100%. The media has been completely corrupted by the corporate ownership. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who would love to do a good job. But, I mean, take a look at what's happened in the Philippines. This huge, supposedly the strongest storm ever recorded. I don't know what that means, but it flattened a small city by the looks of things. I mean, I don't know. It happened at the same time there was one of the world's, I guess, most important conferences, a climate change conference happening in Poland, with representatives from around the world there trying to deal with the issue of climate change. And I didn't even know about it. I didn't even know about it because what's the big news in Canada? Rob Ford and Mike Duffy. And I really accuse the corporate media in this country, and they've done it for years. I accuse them for deliberately creating these crazy news stories which they devote all of their attention to, and not telling Canadians the important life and death issues that are happening in the world today. This is, I mean, what can you call it? A disgrace, it's corruption, it's betrayal, it's murder, it's getting to the point of murder, and it just goes on.
You know, the public is, you know, there's a trend towards, you know, people becoming more aware and more concerned and creative and being critical thinkers, and there's a good trend towards that. But also there's a very strong trend towards where people are really becoming less and less aware and becoming more self-centered, more consumeristic, more fearful, and all that. If you want to Google something, Google the Philippine storm from satellite imagery and look at the size of the storm. That storm was like it had winds, sustained winds like being on the in a tornado, but it wasn't a couple of miles wide. This was as wide as a country, 200 or 300 miles wide, a tornado that big. So I mean, the image of that storm is so unimaginable. The size of the storm, and as you say, if they can just give it a few comments and brush it off like another story of the day, it's really, really disheartening. And a lot of people have died as a result, of not taking action on climate change.
And now there's, tens of thousands of people in a devastated city. They don't really have, there's no road, the roads, all the infrastructure is kind of gone.
Yeah.
And that's, we ran into a friend on our way over here, and he said that's just the beginning. Mm-hmm. And he's absolutely right. This is just the beginning. These insane lunatics who run our country and who run the world, and it's really the people who run the corporations, whoever they are, because it's the corporations who run the world now. They have taken us to the knife edge of destruction. Climate change is a disaster. Fukushima is even worse. What's going on there right now is a nightmare, and it's like it's not happening. The media won't talk about it. Our federal government, Mr. Harper, stopped testing. Canada used to do just ongoing testing for radiation just to see what was going on. After Fukushima, Mr. Harper stopped that. The media doesn't mention it. This is nothing, I don't know what you can call it other than murder, because that's what it is, it's murder. People are dying already and have been for 2.5 years. The numbers showed it right after Fukushima, but the numbers were covered up. And if we can't stop, we're already, but if we've got to remove these people from power, these people have got to be removed from power. And here we are. It seems we're so weak and they're so strong.
Well, there's hope in the federal scene, and as hard as I am on the NDP, the federal NDP has their house more in order, let's say, and they certainly could change federal politics in a dramatic way if they were to form a government. So there's hope in that department. So, what we have to do is really get our priorities straight, and I think, and not only support progressive parties and such, but also get engaged politically ourselves in every way we possibly can, and with all the resources we have, because that is our last hope. We still haven't had that snatched away from us yet, and we have to force these elections to become fair. We have to find ways to be able to check the results of elections these days because of the chances of electronic meddling and changing the numbers, and we've seen that happen in the United States, and with the robocalls and all these other things. We're in an era where we have to be much more vigilant to make the process fair.
Yeah. I would really suggest that I think this country desperately needs a citizens' assembly on democracy in Canada, or a citizens' assembly in democracy in British Columbia. And because what I'm pushing for is just more democracy, just a system where the people of the province and the country and the cities have some power. We have to have some power, because if we don't, we see what's happened, which is total corruption.
That's right.
So we just have to get some power, and the way we should have it is via democracy.
With a fair process, isn't that, that's the bottom line, is that the process has to be constructed in such a way that people can access it, can understand the major issues, has the chance to actually engage and shape decision making and concepts and ideas, and also being able to go to the polls and vote and have their votes counted fairly.
Yeah. And then the people we elect find out what we want.
That's right.
And then they do it. And at the same time, you've got to have an honest media.
I think our leaders should be more issue oriented too, and you and I might diverge slightly on that, but in the sense that leaders do have to lead. Sometimes leaders have to take unpopular stands when their heart tells them that they should do something that they think is important, and they think perhaps the public has been misled.
The leader can take, as far as the leader can take any stand he or she wants, but the leader shouldn't have any more power than anybody else. It has to be what the public wants.
Well, I mean, this is when you're going to. They have been elected to represent us, and they do have to make a call on issues, and I respect them if they're making a call that may not be reflecting.
Well, for example, give me an example.
Well, let's say if a leader started taking a position saying that we have to have exit polls, it was suggested today, on all federal elections, we should be taking exit polls to check whether the voting is fair or not.
Exit polls are supposedly a way of you poll at the voting place to see if the results of the election the counted results are the same as, okay.
Well, as for an example, I mean,
so a leader
this
says
is not being suggested right now. Obviously, it's not going to be a popular notion when it first comes out, but somebody could just say, this is what I represent, this is something I think has to happen, and bring us up to speed on it.
Yeah.
With their profile and their abilities to communicate.
But I would say, at the end of the process, if the public does not want it, because we honestly know the information, in the end it's got to be our decision. It can't be the leader of a political party's decision.
This is when we really have to be cautious, because who are we relying on to find out how we all feel? We're relying on corporate media. So
you've got, I mean, if you're going to have democracy, you've got to have an honest media.
So, we have to be cautious about it.
Yeah. But anyways, I think those are the issues we've got to be talking about as a nation. And yet, those kinds of issues, these things are never, ever, ever mentioned. I mean, how much more do we have to know about the Rob Ford or the Senate story? Nothing changes, but they keep filling the news with it while the real issues are being ignored. Supporting independent media, I think, is something that people can do. There's lots of great newspapers out there. There's lots of great magazines that are independent. Here in Victoria, Street News, Focus Magazine, Watershed Sentinel, many others. CFUV has some great programs on.
Common Sense Canadian.
Yeah, Common Sense Canadian, the Tyee.
There's good alternative sources. Common Ground.
Common Ground is great.
Georgia Strait. I mean, there are lots of publications that are writing.
So people have to start supporting them with effort, time, and money, so that they can grow and we can start to beat the corporations at their own game.
And another great publication, and I was just joking with somebody, but they call it like the New York Times of the West Coast, is Island Tides. It's a publication that comes out of Pender Island, I believe, but it's geared around the Gulf Islands, but always talking about larger issues. The writing's great, the analysis is fantastic. They're always talking about international issues, and very, very, very well thought out articles. And here we have this small little newspaper producing articles that are so far superior than anything you're going to see in the Times Columnist or any of these other local papers.
Or the Vancouver Sun or the Globe and Mail, which is pathetic.
Oh yeah, including the New York Times, by the way.
Yeah,
because they're all setting a tone that's corporate oriented.
The British have some great newspapers. The Guardian, the Independent. I mean, you see things from there. And the Toronto Star does some good stuff. I think it's the one paper that aside from the Island Tides and these other small ones, but
yeah,
the one
well,
big one.
They were going after Rob Ford a lot, weren't they? And they were the ones that got sued for saying that they had a video and all that.
But somewhere in the Star, they also print some truth. I mean, it was from the start that I first heard the story about Stephen Harper being linked to war crimes, which is a huge story that nobody
Yeah.
else has ever touched.
And of course, Harper and Ford being fishing buddies and all that side of the story.
Yeah, we just heard from somebody that Harper and Ford are personal friends. I mean, if that's
Huge,
the case,
big fundraiser for the Harper election was Rob Ford.
It's funny
Ford.
that,
And he is
there's-
an ultra right-wing conservative. If you read or you saw what he's been saying the last few days, and they asked him he's going to resign, he says, "No, I'm going back to work and I'm going to save the people of Toronto. I'm going to save them the taxpayers' money, and this is what I'm doing. I'm saving taxpayers' money." And you're thinking, wow, who does that sound like? That sounds like Stephen Harper. And, so this is where he's coming from. It's a pretty radical right-wing agenda. And it's not a big stretch to see that there's a connection between Ford and Harper.
And I'd also like to mention that Harper, I mean, who is more linked to the drug gangs than Stephen Harper? Because it's his ongoing, never-ending attack on the legalization of marijuana, etc.,
Yeah.
that keeps the drug gangs in business. I mean, he's
Yeah.
their best friend.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet he's presented to the Canadian public as somebody who's opposed to drugs.
Yeah.
But if I mean, everything is backwards, and we're in very dangerous times. We've all got to step up to the plate, as we've said before. Support independent media, push for democracy.
I agree entirely, Jack.
Well, we've done it again. I've lost my voice. Thanks for watching this segment of Citizens Forum. Welcome to segment 2 of Citizens Forum, Wednesday, November the 13th. Our guest in this segment is Rick Habgood. Rick and I have been friends for a long time. And you want to talk about democracy, which is...
Well, it's pretty well your favorite topic, Jack, so I thought, the easiest one to talk about with you anyways. And you have such a wonderful definition of democracy, and maybe you could enlighten the folks where it came
Well,
from.
yeah, it's years ago I started writing a book about democracy, which
Yeah.
I'm still writing, and I was over at your place one time, and you have this big, thick dictionary, and I thought, hey, democracy. So I looked it up in your dictionary, and that was the best definition I've ever seen. And the word democracy comes from the two Greek words, demos, the people, and kratia, to rule. So democracy actually means the people rule. And that's the definition that I believe in. When I think about democracy, that's what it means to me.
I think so too. I think that is, one thing is simple, very easily understood, and I think everybody can relate to it. Everybody can. Like when you think of democracy, you think of the people. If it's not that, it's a dictatorship. So the people and the people rule. And I think that this is a great definition, and
Interestingly, in most dictionaries that you look in today, that isn't the definition.
no, it's not the
they use.
definition, no.
The definition they use today, mostly, is a democracy is a country where the people elect their government.
Yeah.
Well, that's very different. By that definition, Canada is a democracy.
Absolutely. And but you have to, because when I've started on a study of democracy and different types of electoral systems, as you know. And today we're going to be talking about first past the post. But what you just said is absolutely true, because when I was looking through many different definitions of democracy, it wasn't that particular definition.
The people rule.
Yeah, and the interesting part about it is that is the early Greek definition of democracy. That's the one that Plato, Socrates, and all those dudes they're the ones that came up with that particular definition. The definition that we read in Webster's, for example, is British. And as we know, the British have first past the post. So, of course, their democracy is majority rules. Now, and their majority is whoever gets the most votes, which, of course, is first past the post. So it's understandable that they're going to have a different definition. It really is. But I'm with you 100%. That is not a correct definition of democracy. Democracy is, I think, coming from the Greek and Latin, is representation of the people. In other words, the people are represented. You are their representative, and
In
they
fact,
rule.
the people rule. I mean, if it's
Exactly.
not that, then it is, as you said, it's a dictatorship.
So first past the post. The more I look at first past the post, the more I realize where the British probably got their sense of humor. Because it's so ridiculously skewered.
Yeah. And that is the system we use in Canada in all of our provincial
That's right.
elections and our federal election. It's called first past.
And
the
it hasn't
post.
changed that much.
No.
It has changed a little bit. First past the post has been used in Britain since the 13th century. And it's actually pretty well the very first democratic electoral system was first past the post, I believe.
Well, who knows? Who knows?
Have you heard differently?
No, but maybe in old Greece
Yeah,
or
yeah.
you
Well,
know,
we'll find
I've
out
heard
as
that
we go along.
Okay, I've heard that the Iroquois nation in Canada had a way of democracy that was magnificent. Although I don't know anything about it, I've just read occasionally that they did have a wonderful democratic system.
Yeah, there's different
First
democracies.
past the post is a voting system that doesn't really work well
No,
for the people of Canada.
no, it doesn't work well for the people of Britain. It doesn't work well for the people in the States.
Yeah.
So the thing is that here's some the interesting points of view of this particular system, and one of them is that that between the 13th century and 1850, when you elected an MP in Britain, you had to elect two of them. So when you elected somebody from a riding, not just one person, but two people actually went to Parliament. And the reason being is because the second person was a bailsman. And they were called manipulators. And what these people did was they guaranteed that the person that you elected would show up in Parliament instead of going on holidays. In other words, they guaranteed that he would get to work. And that was their job. So they actually had to they were bailsmen. That's what they were. So I know, isn't that bizarre? Now, you've been writing about democracy. Have you heard that one yet?
I've never heard that.
Okay. Well, anyways, I'll give you the website. It is very interesting. And so in Britain, when you elect between the 13th century and the 18th century, when you elected somebody, you didn't just elect one person, you elected two. And one of them was a guarantor who guaranteed that you would show up. Now, that might sound crazy, but that might be a pretty good idea today.
So
Because a lot of these senators don't show up for work for months, and yet we're paying them. And that's the reason.
yeah.
So you see, they were on to something a long time ago, Also with first past the post, there's in certain writings, this is back 13th century, all the way to the 18th century. I'll just give you two examples, although there's many of them. In this one writing called Old Sarum, the fellow was elected one MP, right? Two MPs actually went to Parliament. And in Old Sarum, there was the constituency was populated by one man, two cows, and a field. And that was a riding. And of course, the one man is the guy that got
We got elected.
wound up going to Parliament.
Well, here in
Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah.
This is first past the post.
well, let's bring it up to where we are.
Let's
today.
let's move it up today.
I mean,
Well,
it's
actually,
it's a system that You know, it's funny because we've had two referendums in British Columbia on
Yeah.
changing to a different system.
Yeah.
It was interesting watching the media during those two referendums because the role the media took was to never discuss the problems that First Past the Post has. And it's a system. I mean, first of all, you get a majority government with 40% of the votes, which means that 60% of the voters have no voice whatsoever. But it also leads to things like a couple of elections ago, talking federal elections, the Conservative Party, now run by Mr. Harper, although it was still in its former name, which was the Alliance or something like that.
Reform.
Yeah, Reform, the Alliance. They actually got more votes in Quebec than they got in Saskatchewan. But in Saskatchewan, they won every seat in the federal election, or all but one, whereas in Quebec, they won no seats. So even though they actually had more supporters in Quebec than they did in Saskatchewan, all of those voters in Quebec were completely unrepresented. And in Saskatchewan, it was the opposite, where all the Liberal and NDP voters were completely unrepresented. This happens every election.
Yep.
It happens right across the country.
Yep.
It's the worst voting system in
Absolutely.
the world, I think.
Absolutely.
And because it is so easy for the corporations to control the outcome of this election, of this electoral system, the media pretends that it's a good system. They never tell us the flaws. And this is a big problem for us because we're stuck with a system that is at the root of a lot of the problems we have. If we could change even to this new, a proportional representation voting system, it would give our country a huge lift, at least a hope of starting to move in right directions.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you 100%. I think that First Past the Post is, number one, it's not democratic. When you can win an election on 40% of the vote, what that means is 60% of the vote voted against you. So I would say that the majority of people don't like you all that much. I would say that only 40% of the people like you.
Yeah.
And 60% don't like you. And they don't want you in power.
But there you are.
But the problem is that in writing, as you said, that 60%, all those votes go into the waste paper bin, just bang into the basket, never heard from again.
So if you live in an area,
and it's not democratic.
Yeah,
I mean,
if you live in an
who's
area-
representing that 60%? Okay, sorry.
if you live in an area where, let's say, the Liberal always wins, and
Yep.
you vote Conservative,
Yep.
why even bother going out to vote?
Exactly.
It's a waste of time, and
Precisely.
it shouldn't be.
Exactly.
Because in a proportional system, your vote counts.
That's right.
And I would say that the more progressive and better and best countries in many ways in the world now are using proportional representation systems, and I think
Absolutely.
if we did that in Canada, it would benefit us. That's the only reason I want it, is because I think it is more democratic. And it's a crime that we've been unable, and you can say, well, in the first referendum we had here, 57% of people voted to change to a proportional system. And somehow, under the autocratic rule of Gordon Campbell, 57% lost because Mr. Campbell didn't want to change, and 43% won because that's what Mr. Campbell wanted, and the NDP wanted it,
Yeah.
and the media wanted it,
Yeah.
so it happened.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sad. It's really, really, really sad because I think that when these people, these politicians here in British Columbia and across Canada, I'd say most of them, talk the talk about being for the people and representing the people and all the rest of it. But when push comes to shove, when they really want to put in a system that actually honors the people that they represent, they won't go for it. It's just like this, the STV. And you and I interviewed John Horgan. Do you remember that?
Yeah, on
Years
the
ago.
radio
Do you
show.
remember
We used
that?
to have a radio show. Okay.
I know. And you know,
Yeah.
I asked John, this was after the election, and I asked John, I said, well, John, where did you stand on STV, single transferable vote? And he goes, oh, I voted for it, Rick. And I said, you voted for it? And he says, yeah, I voted for it because my daughter wanted me to. And I thought to myself, that's got to be the worst reason in the whole world to vote for STV, because your daughter, why not vote for it because you want it? Why not vote for it because you want change? Instead of, you know, this system of, this dictatorial system of first past the post. And anyways, it was one of the moments in history that the NDP just blew.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, they blew it. You know, they had the opportunity, if they had spoke out, if they had, you know, the backroom boys didn't want, you know, they still clutched the power, right? This is what it's all about. First past the post, as you know, is all about power. It's got nothing to do with representing the people. And when you vote in a first past the post system, you're voting for a party. That's what you're doing. You don't, the people, the public, are only secondary pawns in the game. What really matters is the party.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Now
And so that's what you're voting for. You're not voting for the public.
And you were in Germany recently,
Yes.
and Germany has a proportional representation
They do.
system, a very good form of proportional representation.
Right.
And I think you spoke to people there who linked some very progressive things in Germany to the fact that they have a more democratic voting system.
Yeah, well, you see, there is something that Canada, BC, could really pick up on it if we were blessed with progressive politicians, like politicians that actually cared about you know, the public. Then this first past the post, which is it's a dictatorial system that should not exist anywhere, really. You know, we should get rid of it. In Germany, you're absolutely right. The fellow that you're referring to is a fellow by the name of Heinz, and he was a German social scientist. And Heinz said, which is what we're going to talk about in the next segment, which is a month from now. Heinz said that proportional representation is the engine that drives the democracy. He says, but you have to have all the parts of that engine working in unison to make it work properly. He said, just because you have proportional representation doesn't mean that you're automatically going to be successful. You have to use that and use it to build a social democracy, he said. So we're going to talk about that a month from now. You know, that's what the next segment is going to be about, proportional representation, and how that actually affects not only the general public, but also corporations and the media. And it has a definite different, there's not this infighting all the time. There's more of a cooperation because there has to be.
Yep. I agree. It's a way forward, I think.
It's got to be.
Yeah.
Fair Vote Canada, that we want to, you know, if you want to be a part of this process of changing our electoral system, you can go to fairvotecanada.ca and learn all about it and become part of it, because that's what we need. And I'm not a representative from Fair Vote Canada, and neither are you, but I know we both support that.
Yeah. I think it's a step towards giving us the ability to control our country. So
That's
that's
right.
why I think we should do it.
Exactly.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks for watching this segment of Citizens Forum.
Welcome to the first show of Choices in Your Healthcare. In this show, we will be interviewing various healthcare professionals from around southern Vancouver Island and discussing with them the choices they offer for us in our healthcare. Today I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa Polensky, a naturopathic physician and co-owner of Sage Clinic here in Victoria. Welcome, Dr. Polensky, and thank you for joining us on the show.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Maybe we can start off by you explaining what you would find are the common causes, or you have found in your practice, the common reasons why people seek out naturopathic medicine.
Sure. They do fall into a number of different categories that are very common. Probably the first one is anything to do with digestive issues. So we might see young children, babies with colic, for example, all the way up to seniors who perhaps have irritable bowel syndrome, digestive constipation, things like that. So digestive is usually number one.
Okay.
The second typically is anything to do with allergies, food allergies, hay fever, anything along the sort of inflammatory spectrum. Sometimes that can be also asthma, hay fever, those kinds of things.
Sure.
Very common and unfortunately rising in incidence, but that's typical. Probably the third one would be anything to do with hormonal issues. So typically a naturopathic patient is usually a female by and large in the 30 to 50 age category. And so
Right.
a lot of times hormonal issues are significant. They might be premenstrual syndrome or postpartum depression, menopausal issues, those kinds of things. So hormone balancing is probably the third.
Okay.
The fourth is insomnia, which apparently affects 40% of the population of.
I wouldn't have guessed it was that high.
It's huge. It's very significant, and medications usually are not the solution for a lot of people. So
Right.
that would be the fourth category. And the fifth typically is anything to do with mood. So depression, anxiety, combinations of those types of concerns. Even just people being low motivation, lack of energy, melancholy, that kind of thing. So definitely those five.
Well, you've certainly touched on some of the major issues that
Yes.
healthcare is struggling with right now.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your training. What is entailed in becoming a naturopathic physician?
Yeah, so it basically is similar to a medical doctor in the sense that there is an undergraduate degree and then a doctoral degree. The difference primarily is in how we treat. And so what we learn through the school and the education is like botanical treatment, homeopathic treatment, nutritional treatment. So we have 8 years of training, and then usually I did an extra year as a residency, so I had a continued year.
Okay.
And we also work in clinic as we're going through school, so it's pretty exhaustive. There's 4 schools in the States and 2 in Canada.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago botanicals. What do you mean by that?
So, but yeah, botanicals is actually herbal medicine or herbal, it depends on how you pronounce it.
Sure.
Using plants as the form of medicine. And so they'll be in concentrates or capsules or small tinctures, extracts, those kinds of things. And they'll be used for all manner of conditions from
Okay.
supporting heart, hypertension, right through to digestive issues.
Sure.
Yeah.
So then why would somebody seek out your services as opposed to going to their medical doctor?
Well,
What would be the difference?
yeah, oftentimes people will come partly because they want to pursue a more natural approach. They might be a bit concerned about, say, pursuing a pharmaceutical approach to a condition, or perhaps in the past they've tried that and it just hasn't worked for them.
Right.
A lot of times people will come in with sort of a concept of lifestyle. They may do yoga, they may exercise, are conscious of their foods, and they want a medicine that's sort of in sync or in line with their approach. So that's often it. And sometimes we'll get people where they just haven't seen any success with any other type of medicine. So there'll be people who maybe have never heard of us before, but they just heard their friend give a recommendation and they say, okay, I don't know what you guys do, but I just need help.
Yeah.
So it
yeah.
will kind of come from that angle as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier as well hormones. I know there's a lot of controversy around hormone replacement therapy.
Yes.
I understand that the naturopathic community has something different.
Yes. Well, I sort of think of it as a spectrum. Hormone replacement therapy is the more pharmaceutical, and it's definitely on the end of the spectrum. But if you start sort of on the other side, there's oftentimes a lot of nutritional things that you can do that will change hormonal expression in the body.
Okay.
Then there's botanical or herbal. Then there's sort of a little bit more almost like a natural hormonal approach that's plant-based, I would say sort of in the middle there. And then there's bioidentical, which is more like what's in the body, and yet it is a little bit more of an external sort of hormonal focus. So there's a whole range. And women really respond well, depending on the person, to sort of one of any of those.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can prescribe actually medications, but I typically don't, because I'll usually find other solutions. So those will be sort of the last resort.
Sure.
Yeah.
Before the show, you and I had been speaking about the term green medicine, and I was quite intrigued by that. Can you elaborate a bit for us on what that is?
Yeah, yeah. Green medicine, it's actually something, I mean, I've practiced for now 14 years, and I've often thought about the environmental impact of our food and our nutrition, but also the medicine. And what really came to me about green medicine is the idea of how a medicine is created and how it impacts the environment is one part of it. And so herbal medicine and homeopathic remedies are usually very tiny portions of a plant. So a lot of times the plant remains intact while the remedy is created. But the other part of it is if a person consumes a pharmaceutical, for example, when they excrete in the urine or in the stool, the pharmaceutical actually does not biodegrade and it is not altered. So it ends up, which is an unfortunate concern, but it ends up in the waterways, it ends up in the ocean, it ends up in the soil. There's for example, one class of medicine called SSRIs, which are support for depression and mood, and they're actually being detected in shellfish and in the ocean. So the concept of green medicine to me is if someone has an option, which we all do, for how we're going to treat our bodies, if you chose an herbal or a botanical option or a homeopathic, you're not going to negatively impact the environment just by virtue of utilizing that medicine. And unfortunately, the pharmaceuticals is more along that path.
Don't break down.
Yeah, and certainly I completely agree. Some of them are absolutely necessary, but given a lot of situations, the natural remedy is effective, it's very safe, and then now if we think of the environment, it will not negatively impact
Sure.
the environment. Yeah.
Well, if everybody was using the green medicine, we wouldn't have to have the sewer treatment plant, supposedly.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yes, well,
We'll get another day.
and apparently they're not altered in the sewage treatment either, so that even wouldn't affect it.
Goes
It's
right through.
beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit what you personally bring into your practice. What does Lisa, Dr. Polinsky, bring into her practice?
Well, I was thinking sort of how am I distinct? And I think one thing, my undergrad degree was in psychology. I went to UVic and I pursued psychology. I was always interested in human behavior and people's sort of drive and what made them tick. And I brought that into the medicine in terms of I'm often thinking about what's important for that person, what are the stressors with this person. So I sort of think of it as like the psychology of healing and health and people taking steps towards that. So I think that is one aspect, and I also, being a mother of young children and kind of going through different hormonal changes myself, I think having the experience and then being able to be real with people, you know, if I'm giving them a treatment plan, I'm often thinking, well, would I be able to do that?
That's very important.
Yeah, it is, and I didn't used to be that way, but you know, going through it with children, it kind of changes things. So
Having children does change your perspective on a few things, doesn't it?
it does, yeah, it definitely
Sleep.
does. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
Good, okay.
yeah.
Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. You were talking about the digestive issues. How would you treat, say, irritable bowel syndrome, or
Right.
how would you approach that if somebody came in and said, I have Crohn's, I have colitis,
Right.
and I've kind of lost any further ability to treat allopathically?
Well, and that's a great example. I mean, I'll start with irritable bowel because that tends to be the bigger category. But usually what happens in that situation is a person has a couple difficulties. One is they don't know what to eat. They feel oftentimes they're better if they just don't eat.
Right.
So part of what we do is figure out what are the foods that they're sensitive to. And there's a couple different ways we can go.
Can you elaborate on that a bit for us? Because I know there's a lot of confusion about how to get tested for food allergies.
Right. Well, there's food allergies, which are more the immune response,
Right.
and that's through a blood test. So that we can do. There's labs in the States that we send the blood to.
Okay.
So that is one option. I tend to do one in office that I've learned that's a little unique. It's food sensitivity testing,
Okay.
and that's through an acupuncture point and testing resistance.
Okay.
So right in the office, people will leave with a list of these are the foods that you likely are sensitive to, and then that's kind of close to if they do introduction, elimination, reintroduction sort of process. But this is a little more exact.
Okay.
And so they'll leave with a list of what foods may be the best choices for them to avoid for a month.
Sure.
So it's usually a diet issue, what foods, and then the second part is what is happening with the bacterial balance in their digestive system. And usually we see with irritable bowel system, or irritable bowel disease, or irritable bowel syndrome, that they've lost the balance of digestive function. So
Right.
they might have a history of numerous antibiotics, which will change the bacterial balance, possibly stress or some kind of combination. And so they'll have bloating, they'll have gas, they'll have difficulty, they'll have urgency, all those kinds of things that when they get the right bacteria or probiotics, which are supportive for bacterial growth, acidophilus is a very common one.
Right.
When they get the right dose and the right potency, and that's very important, plus the good sort of appropriate diet for them, that can make all the difference.
Okay.
So those are really the two steps.
Two main
Yeah,
steps.
yeah.
Just to put it in perspective for the viewers, I was reading a couple of weeks ago that we have around 1 trillion cells in our body, and we have 100 trillion bacteria in our body.
Right.
So we basically are a walking bacteria, and when that balance gets out of balance, then we're in trouble.
Exactly. And I learned recently as well, about 2 pounds of our body weight is bacteria. So
Is that right?
yeah.
Okay. So then when you mention probiotics, what do you mean by probiotics? Where would somebody get probiotics, or what are common sources?
Yeah, so probiotics just means sort of pro-life, and that's the bacteria that support life. And there's around 400 or so different strains of bacteria in our digestive system.
Okay.
Some of them are supportive and some of them aren't. So the probiotics are the strains that are very helpful and beneficial. Again, acidophilus is one common one that people know. And they can get them through diet, although a lot of people are dairy sensitive, and sometimes yogurt is the source of that. But if a person is sensitive to dairy, then they can actually just get it through a powder or a capsule of the bacteria. So
Keep it that way.
yeah, it can make a huge difference. Yeah. Sometimes people will come in thinking, I'll eat a lot of yogurt, but then it actually makes their system worse. And
Yes.
yeah, not always the solution.
Okay.
And another source too is fermented foods such as sauerkraut or kimchi. That can be a source of support for bacterial balance as
The
well.
nice thing about those two is that they're fairly easy to make at home.
Right.
I make my
yes.
own sauerkraut, and I make enough for the whole winter, and it costs me probably $10.
Right. Beautiful.
And I have fun
Yeah.
making it. I get out in the farmer's fields and pick my cabbage, and
Yeah.
so it's a very, very approachable way of helping your health.
Right. And what I understand is a lot of traditional cultures would usually have a form of a bacterial support like that, some kind of food that was fermented that was just a traditional food.
Right.
And we sort
Now,
of
what
lost
about
that.
miso?
Miso, yes,
that another
exactly.
one that-
That's another one.
That's
yeah.
another one.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
In your opinion, would it be important to be getting organic miso?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
why is that?
Well, that does sort of nod a little bit to the concern around genetic modification. So if somebody, so an organic source, Canadian, local, brilliant, that would be
Okay.
great. But anything other than that, from a soy form, you're potentially getting into a genetic modification. And apparently 80% of all the soy crops are already genetically modified in the States and in other locations.
So if you had somebody come into your office with digestive concerns and their diet was in fact including a fair amount of GMO, would that be an issue for you? Would you?
Yes,
It would be.
absolutely. And that's a very good point. One of the issues there is that the protein is altered in a genetically modified food. And proteins are what people tend to react to with more of an allergenic situation or digestive problems. So absolutely GMOs, in my opinion, are a concern
Okay.
and something you definitely want to avoid.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's something to remember
Yes.
when we're shopping next time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'll read the labels. Yeah.
Do you do much work with infants?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
What is your passion with infants?
I love working with the children because to me that's true prevention. If you can help a little child, for example, with colic, I love the infants where they come in and they might have some digestive issues. There's infant probiotics that we can give, and there's medicine for babies, and helping the nursing mother as well can be helpful. But the way I think, prevention in medicine really starts at that age. Because if you can help their system in those early years, you've helped their immune system for their whole life.
Sure.
So
sure.
to me, that's really very exciting.
What I understand about the bacteria in the immune system is that in the first few years, that's when it's established.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
if you can keep that established, you have a child with health thereafter.
Right, absolutely. I
Excellent.
very much agree with that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And how long have you been in practice now?
I've been in practice 14 years.
14
so,
years?
yeah,
And your clinic is located here in Victoria.
in Victoria. Yep, down on Fort Street, Fort and Quadra.
And I understand you're a third generation Victorian.
Yes, yeah. My grandmother, my parents, myself. So yes, and I think actually her mother as well wasn't born here, but she was born up in BC. So 4th generation BC, 3rd generation Victorian.
Good. And where's your practice located?
It's Suite 304, 852 Fort Street.
On Fort Street.
So Fort and Quadra right downtown, the Sage Clinic. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Polinsky, thank you very much for coming on to the show. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing your knowledge with us and the viewers.
Mhm.
Well, that's it for today, folks. I'd like to thank you for watching. My name is Cameron Moffat, and I'm an osteopathic practitioner here in Victoria. And on behalf of myself and the crew at Cable 4, I'd like to thank you for watching Your Choices in Healthcare. And until the next episode, thank you and have a good day.